It has been described as the gatekeeper of the world's economy, but does the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, serve the interests of all of its members? This is Roundtable with me, David Foster. Well, this month the IMF, the World Bank, and I believe it's still there, 189 members get together to talk about the way the world is going to look. And one matter that might well come up is whether the current economic order works for everyone. There are those who believe that the IMF's policies and the framework that allows it to exist are not necessarily a good fit for all. July 2015, a very public economic meltdown. A country in debt and on its knees. Greece was forced to bend to the will of its creditors in exchange for much-needed cash. Public sector pay freezes, rising sales tax, pension reform. They were some of the conditions, dictated in part by the International Monetary Fund.
Σε χειρότερη μοίρα από αυτοί που την έχουν καταντήσει ως σήμερα. Ποιοι μας τρομοκρατούν? Αυτοί που έφεραν στη χώρα το χάος και μας απειλούν με το χάος.
Is Greece an example of what some see as heavy-handedness from the IMF? Are its loan conditions too intrusive? And should the IMF be imposing its economic policies on the countries it helps? The IMF was conceived in the late stages of the Second World War, designed to combat the protectionist attitudes that led to previous economic turmoil.
This urgent effort to avert an economic catastrophe, which, if it were once allowed to begin, might soon engulf us all, calls for many contributory approaches.
Today, the fund has many priorities.
We are helping Libya develop a modern system of government payments. We're helping Tunisia improve its financial sector, and we're helping Jordan with fuel subsidy reforms.
Its managing director, Christine Lagarde, has become a household name. She is a key player on the political stage, tackling anything that can affect the global economy.
Like Libya, like Syria,
perspective on the refugee crisis,
the Ebola virus.
But critics say the IMF's loan conditions can compromise economic and political sovereignty. Developing countries are encouraged to exploit natural resources to generate quick revenue. Cuts to government spending can see healthcare underfunded, and forced divestment in agriculture can lead to food shortages.
Our loans to countries experiencing difficulties, our loans are conditional upon various requirements, but all of them aim at restoring stability, restoring growth, and debt sustainability.
But it is recognized generally as a force for good, keeping countless economies afloat. In 1995, the IMF stepped in during the Mexican peso crisis. The fund's economic reforms helped to keep India from default in the 1990s, and Turkey's agreements with the IMF date back to the 1950s. Three countries that now rank among the world's faster-growing economies. The IMF's objective is to promote global financial stability. But in trying to put itself at the center of the world's economies, is it actually failing its members with what some say is a one-size-fits-all neoliberal agenda? Well, for this roundtable, we are joined via Skype from Washington, D.C. by Nadia Daar, who is head of Oxfam's office in the U.S. Capitol. Her work focuses on international financial institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank. From New Hampshire, also via Skype, the economist and author Jonathan Perkins. With me at the roundtable today, Michael Wilson, broadcaster and host of Jazz FM's Business breakfast. To my left, Danai Kyriakopoulou from the think tank, the Official Monetary and Financial Institutions Forum. I'm sure it's a lot simpler than it sounds. And Ali Guven Burak, a lecturer in international relations and the international political economy at Birkbeck University. Thank you all very much indeed for coming in. Danai, let me ask you first of all, you were born in Greece. You have a long heritage in Greece, and yet the people of Greece seem to hate the International Monetary Fund. Why, when it is setting out to be a force for good, is there such an objection to it?
Greece is an economy whose fortunes have not been very positive over the past 8 years, to say the least. It has gone through a lot of troubles. Economically, it has suffered, and a lot of its people are not satisfied in the way the economy works. The IMF has played an important role in that. It is one of the three forces of the Troika. It has been one of the creditors to Greece, and those loans have come with conditionality, with tough economic reforms. The people are
so the IMF screws down countries that it's giving money to help it so that it bends to the IMF's will.
The IMF is only one of the forces in Greece, and it has argued for significant debt relief in the case of Greece, which a lot of Greeks and the Greek government itself think is an important condition for the country's recovery.
The problem is, David, as you mentioned in your introduction to this, the IMF is this neoliberalist organisation. That is the zeitgeist that we're in at the moment. This is what financial institutions want to hear, and you put yourself in the place of what I think is probably the best of worst opportunities that were existing. Remember, this is 1944 when all this started. It's a long, long time ago when Europe was in ruins, and a lot of people were getting together to try to say, how can we stop this happening again? And the IMF has really because it is the gatekeeper to the World Bank, it has to stay in line with what the majority of financial institutions who will lend to it actually believe in. And that happens to be cutting down debt, privatising things that we're talking about Greece, which has turned out to be impossible.
You see, is it protecting rich corporations' interests rather than the people of these countries?
Well, it does in some ways, but in the case of Greece, I would say the European Union was the main power that set those conditions, whereas the IMF had a more lenient approach in general. And that is very much in line with the more recent IMF practice of having slightly more positive view of capital controls, for example, social spending targets in its programs. So it is still very much a core neoliberal organization, but there is some relaxation
let me bring in
of
Jonathan.
that basic hardcore beliefs.
Jonathan Perkins in New Hampshire, I should mention your book because you've been at the sharp end of this, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Are we seeing effectively like a Robin Hood in reverse, robbing from the poor and giving to the rich?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to understand that the World Bank and the IMF are part of a very old system that now is failing us. And incidentally, I am in New Hampshire and was just at the hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, where the IMF and World Bank were formed in 1944. I spent the night there a couple of nights ago. And as I sat in the room where those documents were signed, I couldn't help but thinking that was during a time when we considered that resources were incredibly abundant. The Earth's resources were just unlimited. And also the ability to pollute, to just throw all of our garbage into the oceans and the air, we saw that as absolutely essential and never-ending. And it was also a time when world populations were much smaller. So I think in those days, the World Bank, the IMF, all of those institutions were formed with a real good purpose, and they worked for a while. But we've reached a time now when we know that the Earth's resources are very limited, and its ability to take in all of the pollution that we cause on land, water, and in the air is extremely limited. And yet the IMF and the World Bank are still operating under a system that says economic growth at the expense of social and environmental factors must continue.
And Jonathan, Nadia in DC, Washington DC from Oxfam, you're nodding your head at what Jonathan is saying.
Well, I'm nodding my head because I think that it is true that there are a number of different programs, operations, and policies that both of these institutions are promoting, and where poverty is not necessarily their front and center mission when you look at the actual impacts. So social and environmental harm, we are seeing a lot of that still in a number of World Bank operations, particularly in their private sector operations, where the money, frankly, there's a dead end for understanding where that money ends up in almost half of the IFC, the private sector arms investments, when it's lending to the financial sector. In terms of responsibility of these institutions, I would argue that they actually do have a lot of leverage of their own and do have a lot of responsibility on their own to be promoting policies that are going to reduce poverty and reduce inequality.
Well, Nadia, we'll talk about that a little bit later in the programme, but let's come back to the studio if I may. The suggestion seems to be that if the IMF is not financially raping these particular countries, then perhaps it's turning a blind eye to other people doing so. In the opinion of some.
I think the thing to remember about the IMF is, first of all, its voting structure is very much tilted towards the United States. 17% of the votes on the IMF. Unlike something like the World Trade Organization, which can have blocks of countries, that can't happen as far as the IMF's concerned. What's also happened is we were going back to 1944 again and talking about what the world isn't like that anymore. The United States is coming under a huge amount of pressure to become much more protectionist. The whole economic agenda is moving east. It's moving to China. It's not about the World Trade Organization. It's not about the World Bank. It's what all these countries that said goodbye to the IMF and the World Bank and amassed all their own foreign reserves, and they will change the shape of the world over the next couple of decades.
Well, the world is changing. The economic gravity is shifting eastwards. I think the IMF is very well aware of that. There have been a lot of speeches by Madame Lagarde, by other actors in the IMF. The quota system has been developed to reflect that. And countries that you mentioned that have had the experience of the IMF in the East are also engaging with it now much more than they were in the past. Indonesia, for example, will be hosting the next IMF meetings next year. So you have a country where the IMF had a very bad reputation in the past, now hosting its annual meetings, which will be a very symbolic move for the region.
One of the things we're doing is we're talking as if a lot of people already know a great deal about the IMF. So Ali, help me with this, if you would. Give me some examples of where it has been a force for good, where it's done something really important that's helped the world and that country, and perhaps the opposite.
Well, it's hard to say that in the case of the IMF because IMF programs tend to be fairly short-term. And when you look at long-term impact of it, the evidence can be quite mixed. I find myself in the unpalatable position of defending these organizations here. But
you don't have to defend them, you can say whatever you want.
I broadly agree with John and Nadia on the general way of these organizations. Having said that, we should not underestimate their adaptive efficiency, their capacity for survival. And when you look at an organization such as the World Bank, its largest borrowers are India and Brazil and China and Turkey and Argentina and Mexico. So essentially, they are doing a lot of business with the World Bank. At the same time, they are pushing through alternative organizations such as the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And these are the same countries that usually lobby for the removal of environmental and social safeguards. They lobby against anti-corruption rules within these organizations. So actually, when you look at that power shift in the global economic balance, roles are very muddled and very complicated. In that sense, I think there's a lot of texture in the way these organizations handle themselves these days.
Jonathan, come to you on that one. Respond, if you would, to what Ali has to say. And also this suggestion I put forward that the IMF effectively turns a blind eye to what is happening in these countries because it simply wants to get its money back and protect larger institutions and corporations.
I spent a lot of time in Latin America. I meet with leaders of many countries there. I have for many years. And they'll tell me these days that they'll much rather borrow money from the Chinese funded banks than from the World Bank or the IMF, partly because, as it's been pointed out here this morning, the IMF and the World Bank are basically U.S. organizations, and they support big multi-global corporations. A lot of these countries will tell you that they have a history of implementing policies that are very difficult for those countries to accept. And when the countries don't accept them, the United States has a history of going in and overthrowing governments, as we've done in Chile and Argentina, many different places, or possibly getting their leaders assassinated. And I was a job I was very familiar with as an economic hitman. That message has gotten out, and the IMF and the World Bank are associated with these very brutal policies. And so a lot of these countries today are saying, look, there's another option. There hasn't been another option for quite a few years.
I might just come back
John,
and say that,
Nadia
as our
jumping in. Yeah, carry on, Nadia.
Well, as our previous colleague on the panel just mentioned, a lot of these new institutions are coming online. There are other options for governments to access finance from, and development finance at that. The Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, the new BRICS Bank that has come online a couple of years ago. But yet, as we heard, we're still seeing China taking money from the World Bank. We're still seeing all of these emerging economies still playing a really important role at these institutions. And so I think we have to understand and start thinking about, well, what is the added value and what is the role of the World Bank and the IMF in today's global economy when there are indeed other financial players that are stepping up in the world?
Okay, what does it do to protect you and me in the long term?
Well, in the long term, it's a search for stability, basically. And we all like stability. It's a search for a status quo. And one could argue that there is no status quo in the world. There's no status quo in the financial world. But that's what it was trying to do in 1944. That's what it is still trying to do. I know that probably somewhere throughout this program you're going to say, well, how long will it last and what's the alternative?
Well, that was going to be near the end, yes.
Indeed. And it's very, very difficult to get that, because we all want to have certainty. And at the moment, we can't have that. So what it's doing to protect you and me is to know that when we walk out of this door, that our bank accounts are relatively safe, and that the financial markets will still work in the way that we expect them to work, and that our pensions...
Well, that sounds like a great idea, but it needs to change in
Well, I'm talking about the UK and Europe, not necessarily Greece, of course, which is a different matter.
Well, in terms of added value that the IMF provides, I think beyond the politics, the loans, there is also the technical expertise, the promotion of research. You have a very huge organization, a lot of economists working there, a lot of brain power, the research they do on all sorts of issues, not just financial stability, exchange rate controls. They've also moved into new areas such as climate finance. For example, the World Bank is looking very closely at green bonds, green finance, green equities. They are addressing issues such as climate change that were mentioned earlier. And also, as our world changes, issues such as digital currencies, which Christine Lagarde mentioned in her speech here in London last week. So they are at the forefront of all those research areas, and I think we should not underestimate that technical expertise that the IMF brings to the table.
What about attitude? Because when they were looking to replace Dominique Strauss-Kahn, and Christine Lagarde was put forward as an option, I think Angela Merkel said, oh yes, she's European, but she needs to be European. Then there will be a role for developing countries in the future. Patronising, ignoring.
Yes, it is quite really. When you look at the governance structure, the American voting power or voting share of 17% actually is a veto power, because in the board of directors you need 85% in order to push through important decisions. So the US still has a veto power. Having said that, I do think that there is a slight move towards more borrower discretionary practice over the past few years in these organizations. Not sufficient, not coherent, but they are very much aware of the criticisms directed against them, and they have various, they did numerous things, the discontinuation of structural performance criteria, for example, hard conditionality gone now. The program for results, World Bank supporting existing government programs rather than pushing through its own agenda. These are all very small items, but when you just add these up, there is a change, slight change in attitude, but absolutely agree that fundamentally these are not large enough, these are not sufficient, these are not, these institutions are in a way too big to fail. They have surveillance functions,
that before, haven't we?
Expertise functions. Of course, I use it in
the historical
yes, in a historical way. Yet they will muddle through. That's what they have done for a very long time.
Let's go to Oxfam once again. You are at the sharp end of a lot of this, Nadia. Two questions rolled into one, if you'll excuse me. Do you, as was suggested, feel safer with the World Bank there than you would do if it weren't there? And what particular changes would you like to see? What are you looking at?
All right. So, I mean, I think the first thing, maybe I wouldn't use the word safer, but I would say that, you know, when we're thinking about development finance and we're thinking about good development that supports the alleviation of poverty, we also have to look at the relative scheme of things. And relatively speaking, the World Bank is a fairly transparent institution. It is a fairly accountable institution. There are ways through which citizens in countries where the World Bank is operating can engage the institution, and that's very different from a lot of other financial players.
So do you sort of think of the IMF and World Bank as one thing rolled into different sort of corners?
No, I actually don't. I think that, you know, when we look at governance and the kinds of decisions being made, of course, you know, the board is made up of governments and a lot of the same ones at that. But in terms of their mission, in terms of their mandate, in terms of the entry points through which we can influence them, I do think that they are quite different. Where they do need to change, I think, is a fundamental shift in understanding and proactively supporting countries to reduce inequality, because for Oxfam, inequality is really a fundamental issue that needs to be addressed globally if we are going to have any chance of ending extreme poverty. In January, we put out a stat that really showed that 8 men own as much as half of the world. And so just that stark inequality that exists is a problem that both institutions need to address. And while the IMF has really in rhetoric said a lot on inequality, and you know, as one of our guests said, they are moving and changing the way they talk. Madame Lagarde has really put an emphasis on gender issues, for example, and on inequality. We need to see that shift in rhetoric change in their operations as well.
John, obsolete, unrepentant, not fit for a modern world, and I'm not talking about an economic hitman, I'm talking about your opinion of the IMF.
Well, I think when we talk about stability and we talk about economic growth, let's face it, we're a bunch of white people sitting around here talking about this. We all are pretty wealthy by world standards. We're not one of those 8 that own as much wealth as half the world. But a great deal of the world is a great deal of the world is very unstable, and a great many people are on the verge of starvation, or actually starving. And I think we forget all of that. And these institutions we've been talking about have done a very good job of serving what I'd call the wealthier part of the world, which includes us, the middle class, in most of Europe and the United States and North America. But it has not done a very good job of serving the poor. As somebody earlier pointed out, 8 individuals have as much wealth as half the world's population.
Okay, John, well, look, I'm going to have to leave it there for now and bring it back to the studio. If not the World Bank, if not these monolithic organisations, what then? In 100
Do you know, I don't know, David, and I don't think anybody does. We're sitting on a volcano right now, and the gap between rich and poor, the rise of popularism, the inevitable, inexorable shift of power in the world to the east, which is happening. We don't know how it's happening. We don't know how big it is, because we simply cannot penetrate what's actually happening in places like China at the moment. But I don't think it will exist in maybe 100 years' time. What to put in its place, I don't know, but it won't be based in Washington.
But if nobody knows exactly what will come in its place, the danger is that there could be a vacuum, and with that vacuum, what?
We're certainly moving towards a multipolar world. In the monetary side of things, we're moving towards a multi-reserve system in currencies. The SDR, the special drawing right, the IMF's own currency basket, is now, as of last year, including the renminbi. So it's a much more multipolar world in terms of the East and emerging markets having a much bigger say. In the IMF meetings that are coming up next week, a lot of the events and the focus is on emerging markets. OMFIF are putting out a lot of events on emerging markets.
As a threat to the IMF, or as part of?
Well, there are new institutions like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, like China's Belt and Road program, the new development bank that we heard about earlier. They are not a threat to the IMF. They're working together quite closely. So I think we're just moving towards a more multipolar system.
Yeah, the problem is that as multipolarity grows, the structures of multilateralism are lagging behind and adapting to that change in the balance of power, and that is the crux of the matter for the IMF and the World Bank. As to what might replace them, I don't see any clear candidate given the size of these organizations, their expertise, and most importantly, their political legitimacy. However poor, however faulty, you can't really establish an institution to replace them so easily. So that is an issue. Sorry.
Yeah, I know you wanted to say something, Michael, but I've got to give the last word to John, simply because he's been involved in this, as he's a self-described economic hitman. Has it been a form of international 20th, 21st century colonialism of which we should be ashamed as an international community, or has it been a salve and saved the world from going down the plug hole?
It's a mixed bag, David. I think, at the beginning, in resurrecting Europe that was very demolished by World War II, it was a savior. And then it got deeply involved in the Cold War. And so the World Bank began to take the sides of capitalism against Sovietism and sided with the big corporations. And in a way, it's been doing that ever since. So it's been a mixed bag. I think the World Bank does have an opportunity to turn that around and become a force for good, but it's going to have to recognize that we're in a different world. We're in a world with limited resources. A lot of people are very hungry, and it needs to recognize that and move in directions that solve those problems as well as the problems of global pollution.
John, thank you very much indeed. And Nadia there, thank you very much indeed to everybody at the table. We've been talking about, you could call it a club if you like, a safety net for things when they go wrong. Nothing, though, as some people have pointed out over the millennia, comes for free, and when large sums of money are borrowed, there will be conditions always attached. This has been Roundtable with me, David Foster. Thank you very much for watching. Hope to see you next time. For now, bye-bye.